Hey everybody, this is not the video I wanted to make on Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun, but here we are. For those of you who may not necessarily be familiar with it, it's a first-person shooter developed by Arc Digital and published by Focus Entertainment that was released last month, May 23rd of this year. And I had actually been looking forward to this game for quite a long time, since it was announced really. Because a retro throwback first-person shooter set in the 40k universe where you're playing as a space marine sounds like a recipe for success. And to be fair, we haven't really had many first-person shooters set in the 40k universe, which is downright baffling because it seems like it'd be kind of a no-brainer thing, but nope, here we are. And to make matters worse, the first-person shooters we have gotten in the 40k universe up to this point have not been good. And we got Fire Warrior, and that came out on PS2 and PC. I have not done a review of it yet, but I will eventually, and it's not going to be fun trying to play that again, because that game was awful. Then there was Space Hulk Deathwing, which was a kind of neat idea, but it ended up being a very tedious slog, and I did a review of that a while back, so if you're interested, you can check that out. Then, of course, we got Necromunda Hired Gun, which also wasn't good. I've also done a review of that, so if you're interested, you can check that out. And then more recently, we got Warhammer 40k Darktide, which is just Vermintide with a 40k skin, and I haven't covered that one either, but I do know that it has a lot of problems right now, so I've just been holding off on even taking a look at it at all. And even then, I still don't really have much interest in Darktide because it is a mindless horde shooter, much like Vermintide 1 and 2 were, and I wasn't remotely surprised when I found out that it has pretty much all of the same problems that those two games had, so I pretty much wrote that game off entirely. So, pickings for first-person shooters set in the 40k universe have been very slim for a long time, and hell, just action games in general have been pretty weak on the 40k front, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The only one that has actually been decent thus far is Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. And while that game certainly has its issues, and it does get pretty repetitive eventually, it's a fairly solid game that is ultimately worth playing. But that's all we've really gotten with Warhammer 40k action games thus far, just decent. And funnily enough, Boltgun is actually a sequel to Space Marine, although if you didn't know that going into it, honestly, you would have no idea throughout the entire time playing it. The game barely even has a story, and there's just not much that they actually tell you throughout the entire game. It's really just the setup of, hey, you're an Ultramarine, and you're being sent onto this planet to help clear out a chaos infestation. And then when you land, it turns out you're the only survivor of the landing, so it's all up to the one lone badass Space Marine to clear out the entire chaos infestation. That's really all you need to know, and frankly, that's really all the story the game actually gives you. The game basically just hands you a chain sword, throws a bunch of enemies at you, and tells you, go and cleanse this place for the Emperor. And don't get me wrong, that's absolutely fine for a retro throwback first-person shooter. Retro FPSs generally didn't have much in the way of storyline, if they even had one at all. They were almost entirely gameplay driven, so I wasn't really going into Boltgun expecting much in the way of storyline to begin with. So the game's general lack of story and storytelling is not really a problem here. So what is the gameplay of Boltgun like? Well, before I start going into detail, I need you to understand a few things here. The first of them is that even though I was actually looking forward to Boltgun and all of the pre-release trailers and such looked very promising, I actually forgot the game released when it did, because I was caught up doing other things. Namely, I was working on the Memorial Day review of Hell Let Loose, and because I got a bit tunnel-visioned working on that review, just trying to get it done in time for Memorial Day, I actually just didn't really notice what day it was when I was in the middle of working on the Hell Let Loose review, and I got a notification that Boltgun released and went, oh, shit, I should probably get that installed and give that a try and start working on a video for that as well. And so I went and started installing it, and I checked the initial response for the game, and it was overwhelmingly positive on Steam, a ludicrously positive reception, and then I looked and saw that other reviewers had basically echoed that sentiment, saying that it was basically the best thing since sliced bread. So while I had a feeling that a lot of that was hyperbole, and there's also the matter of Steam reviews being entirely binary, you either recommend it or you do not recommend it, and there's really nothing in between there. So you can't really have nuance with the reviews in Steam like you can with other platforms, or you can like a video review like I do. Meaning that Steam reviews at their best are actually fairly unreliable, and they're made even worse by the fact that a lot of people just like to post jokes and memes and such in their so-called reviews of various games on Steam, and that makes them even less reliable, but anyway, point is that the general response to Boltgun has been extremely positive, and thus I was actually fairly optimistic going into the game. It had seemed like something I would thoroughly enjoy from the very beginning of when they were showing the game off, and it had finally launched. It seemed to be in a pretty good state for the most part, and I was expecting that I would be able to enjoy the game. And now, here I sit making this video after playing through the game for a bit under 5 hours, and my prevailing thought after seeing all of the responses to this is, are we playing the same game? Because the Boltgun I played is not some exhilarating wonder of a retro throwback FPS. The Boltgun I played is a bewildering mess that doesn't even get the fundamentals right. Right from the beginning, things just felt off, even down to the simplest things like moving around. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, Space Marines in the Warhammer 40k universe are superhumans. They are huge. They're about 8 or 9 feet tall, and they weigh something like 600 plus pounds of muscle. And that's not counting any kind of cybernetic enhancements that they have. And they are encased in very thick, very heavy power armor that basically makes them thunder around a battlefield. You do get that to some degree in Boltgun. Whenever you move around, your footfalls are heavy and impactful, and the screen does shake a bit, which in turn makes the very floaty, fast movement that you kind of associate with retro FPSs feel really weird. And it makes jumping feel even weirder because you have a lot of air control when you start jumping around. It's a really weird situation because the movement feels floatier than actual retro shooters did, and most other retro throwback shooters for that matter. And yet, from the way they're presenting it and from what you're expecting of a Space Marine, it feels like the movement really should be a lot more deliberate and momentum-based than anything else, and it's just not. It's a situation where what you're seeing and hearing doesn't match up with the way the actual mechanics feel, and even if you can get used to it, it still makes your brain itch. And the itchy brain syndrome continues when you get into the way the gunplay feels, because everything about that is just bizarre. They've decided to try to implement something akin to what the Warhammer 40k tabletop does, where every single unit and every single weapon that they're using has a strength value. The idea here is that if you're attacking an enemy that has a higher strength value than the weapon you're using is going to be less effective. It's going to do less damage. Whereas if the weapon you're using has a higher strength value, then it's going to do more damage against that enemy. But the thing is, it's not as simple as just pick a weapon that has a higher strength value than the enemy you're fighting, because even if you do that, you're not necessarily going to do more damage to them. I mean, your basic cultists and nurglings will go down in a single shot from pretty much anything you're using, and the very early game enemies you're fighting generally will go down in maybe 2 or 3 shots at absolute most. But then you start running into things like Chaos Space Marines and the more powerful demons and things like that, and no matter what you're using against them, they can take a lot of damage before going down. And the progression of this is just bizarre. You start out fighting the basic cultists, and they go down in really 1 or 2 shots at absolute most. Then you start running into some Chaos Space Marines, and they certainly take a fair few more hits to bring down, but even then they pose basically no threat to the player whatsoever. Which is pretty weird, because lore-wise and in the tabletop, they're supposed to be roughly equivalent to Space Marines. They have pretty much all of the same capabilities, but they're tainted by chaos. At least they were roughly equivalent to Space Marines until the whole Primaris thing happened, but that's beside the point. The point here is that Chaos Space Marines should be a considerably larger threat than they actually are in the game. they're really not much more powerful than your basic cultists. And then when you continue on through the rest of Chapter 1, you start running into Nurglings, which are even weaker than the cultists are. They all go down in a single hit from pretty much anything. And then you start running into the lesser demons, and most of them go down in a very small number of shots as well. Until you run into the Plague Toads. You see, lesser Plague Toads are way tankier than they should be. They can take a surprisingly large amount of damage before going down, despite posing no real threat to the player whatsoever. Then you start running into the non-lesser Plague Toads, just the standard Plague Toads, and they are just massive bullet sponges. By that point, you've gained access to the Plasma Gun, which supposedly has a strength of 7, and the Plague Toads, the greater ones I mean, have a strength of 5. This means that the Plasma Gun should do plenty more damage to Plague Toads. It does not. Oh, don't get me wrong, it certainly does more damage to a Plague Toad than the shotgun or the bolter that you have up to that point, but that's not saying much, because it simply has a ton of health and it just takes a lot of shots to bring it down, no matter what you're using. And from the Plague Toads on, you find that more and more enemies just turn into these massive damage sponges that take a ludicrous amount of shots to bring down. And your arsenal doesn't really keep up with them very well. You start out with your chainsword, and then you soon get access to the basic bolter, and then you'll be stuck with that for a surprisingly long time until you get access to the shotgun. Then you have those two weapons until eventually you get access to the plasma gun, and then fairly late into Chapter 1 you get access to the heavy bolter, which is really just a bolter, but it's belt-fed, and it slows you down. So your arsenal by the end of Chapter 1 is actually pretty underwhelming, and then you get to Chapter 2 and it gets rid of all of your weapons except for the chainsword and the bolter, meaning that you have to find all of your weapons again. And as you're going about doing that, the game is still throwing the really tanky enemies at you. I have a feeling this was done to make the gameplay more challenging, but it only results in the gameplay being tedious. The main reason for this is that despite enemies being very tanky, they pose very little threat to the player individually. The enemy AI is dumber than a sack of rocks. At best, they will just charge you directly and get in your face. At worst, they'll just stand there and basically wait for their demise. Clearly, the developers saw that this was a problem, so they decided the best way to make the game more challenging was to do two things. The first of them is to give the enemies that are capable of shooting projectiles at you unerring accuracy. And by that, I mean enemies will be shooting ahead of where you're moving, so that you will just end up walking directly into projectiles. This wouldn't necessarily be that big of a problem if they weren't able to do that through walls. They're able to predict where you're going to be moving and shoot directly in front of you, so that when you move out from behind the wall you were behind, you just walk directly into the projectile. That is quite irritating, and once you find out that that's what's happening, you can start altering your trajectory to make sure that they don't just shoot projectiles to where you're going to run directly into them all the time. But even then, you're still going to take a few anyway. And the reason you're still going to take a few hits anyway is because the second thing they do to try to introduce difficulty into the game is to just throw you up against a lot of enemies all at once. The developers knew that the enemies pose basically no threat to the player, so the only way they can actually try to make the game challenging is to just make a lot of enemies attack you at once and just overwhelm you with sheer numbers. And even that isn't enough to make the game more, air quotes, challenging until they start really narrowing the amount of space you have to maneuver and just make it so you just can't avoid getting hit most of the time. And sure, that technically makes the game more difficult, but it's an incredibly lazy way of doing it. And that ties directly in with the way the levels are designed. These cheap, lazy combat encounters always occur in arenas. You enter an arena, it's going to lock off all of the exits and tell you that the purge protocol has been activated. And then the game will proceed to spawn in enemies until eventually you've managed to eviscerate an arbitrary number of them, at which point the protocol will end and it will open up all the exits and allow you to continue. Between these combat arenas are some areas where you can do some very light exploration, looking for secrets, which aren't actually secrets. None of them are really hidden behind secret walls or anything like that. They're just sitting out in the open and easy to find. so there's not really much point to calling them secrets if they're like that. And as you wander around these areas, you find that there's no clever encounter design, there's no clever puzzles you need to solve or anything like that. You're just moving from one combat arena to the next combat arena. There's nothing interesting about the way the combat arenas are set up. There's nothing interesting about the actual enemy compositions of the arenas. No clever enemy placements. Absolutely nothing about the level design is interesting or compelling. And so a lot of the game just feels like you're playing it on autopilot. You're not even really giving much of a crap about anything that you're doing. The combat's not interesting, the levels aren't interesting. And then you finally get to boss encounters, and you think to yourself, maybe with a boss encounter, it'll finally do something interesting and compelling. Maybe they'll have an interesting boss encounter. And then it turns out that the boss encounter is a locked-off arena where it just continually spawns in lesser enemies, and you just happen to have one particular enemy with a really large health pool that just takes a lot of damage to go down. That's your boss encounter. It is just as cheap and lazy as any of the other arenas where it locks off all the exits and keeps spawning in enemies to fight. Only this time you've just got one really big and supposedly powerful enemy, which turns out to be no more threatening than any of the other enemies that you're fighting. To give you a prime example, the first major boss encounter of the game is against a Lord of Change. It is a demonic entity that in the 40k lore is incredibly dangerous. And yet, on the Exterminatus difficulty, the hardest difficulty in the game, it was so non-threatening to me that I actually had to look at the gameplay footage to determine whether it even hit me at all during that entire boss fight, or whether I was only taking damage from stray shots from the enemies it was spawning in. And when the encounter design is that pathetic, you don't feel like a badass for beating it. You don't feel like a badass the entire time you're just stomping through these enemies like they're basically nothing to you. You just feel like you're playing through something where the game designers didn't really know what they were doing, so they tried to compensate for that with cheap and lazy attempts at making the game, air quotes, challenging, and all it does is just make it more tedious. And then they tried to compensate for their cheap and lazy design even further by making it so that the effect on target is at least kind of satisfying, in the sense that you turn your enemies into meaty chunks all the time. But in the grand scheme of things, that really doesn't help much. At the end of the day, Boltgun is a game that just doesn't get the fundamentals right, and no amount of them acting like it's a power fantasy or turning enemies into meaty chunks can compensate for that. Does that mean it's an absolutely terrible game? No, it's not terrible, but it's definitely not good, and it's certainly nowhere near as amazing as people are acting like it is. I just find myself wondering if it's 40k fans overreacting because the vast majority of 40k action games out there are garbage, and even the best of them, Space Marine, is just decent, nothing amazing. And then this comes along and is still nowhere near as good as Space Marine, frankly, but hey, it's not as terrible as Fire Warrior, so there's that. But that's nowhere near grounds to act like the game's amazing or anything. Or if it's not 40k fans overreacting, and it's just people who are general first-person shooter fans or retro first-person shooter fans, if they've just forgotten what makes good retro first-person shooters, or good first-person shooters in general, or if there's just this general brain rot that is set in and people are willing to accept pretty much anything as long as it's playable from start to finish. But whatever the hell happened there, Boltgun is just an incredibly disappointing game that ends up not even being good, let alone the amazing experience that it's being made out to be. At absolute best, it is still a subpar retro-styled first-person shooter, and you have far superior options out there, like, say, Dusk, or Medieval, or Hrot, or any number of other games of this style. Because Boltgun not only doesn't remotely stack up to any of those, it's just frankly not a good first-person shooter in general. It's not terrible, but it's really not worth playing in the long run. Thanks for watching.